Okay, everybody, thank you very much for the presence, for the streaming presence. We are live broadcasting from University of Campinas in Brazil. And thank you very much for the ones who are watching to this lecture on the YouTube. I am Renato Garcia from the University of Campinas. And this is another session for our webinar on the theme on the subject of industry and economies of innovation, but especially we are talking about industrial policy, innovation policy, and development. I have the pleasure to present for everybody Professor Rainer Kattel. Rainer will present a webinar for us. We will have the chance to listen to Professor Rainer talk about the title of the lecture is How to Make Entrepreneurial State, Why Innovation Needs Bureaucracy, is the same name of his book with some colleagues. Professor Rainer is Professor of Innovation and Public Governance on the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the UCL, the University College of London. He is Deputy Director and Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at UCL, studied at University of Tartu. I'm sorry if I don't spell it correctly, and also philosophy, political philosophy classes and public administration. Professor Kattel has also served as several public policy commissions, including Estonian Research Council, European Science Foundation, OECD, United Nations, European Commission. He published a lot of studies, of research on innovation policy, governance, and specific management issues. For this webinar, we will have the opportunity to discuss one of the key topics on public policy and on industrial policy in specific is the role of bureaucracy, which involves the idea that technological innovation to flourish need innovation bureaucracies such as public research institutions, business incubators, and regulators. Professor Kattel's book moves beyond the question how innovation policy should look like. Rather, it addresses the question of how governments develop capabilities and skills to enable and promote innovation. Kattel, welcome to this webinar at the University of Campinas. It's a great pleasure for us to receive you for this webinar. Thanks to accept our invitation. So, Kattel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renato, for these kind words and the introduction, and of course also for the invitation. So it's a pleasure and the privilege to be here. I always like to talk to colleagues from Brazil because you have a very rich history in industrial policy and innovation, and of course it's one of those great leading countries that it's always interesting to talk to and see what's going on. So I'm here to talk a bit, but I'm also here to learn about your thinking in the space of bureaucracy and innovation. So hopefully it'll be an interesting dialogue for both sides. So what I'll do, I'll talk about the book and some of the issues there, and obviously it's a summary of kinds, and so I try to summarize in a way that is also interesting for those who haven't read the book. And then, so it's like a two parts of the lecture, actually. First is really looking at those key topics in the book around agile stability and role of different kinds of bureaucracies, and also the role of sort of Max Weber's theorizing and how can we take it forward today, and thinking about sort of new Weberian agencies as well that the book makes the argument for. And then the second part is more looking into the idea of capacities and capabilities and how can we think of those issues in the context of innovation policy or innovation in general. So it's perhaps slightly more conceptual, but still I try to bring some of the thinking that is also we have done after the book has been published. So it's and so I'm keen to hear your feedback as well. So let me just share the screen so you should be able to see that. So now I think you're seeing the full screen mode, right? So yeah, so this is the book, and I wrote it with two colleagues of mine, and it's out since a year, and yeah, it's really the key point of the book, or why we wrote the book and why we titled it the way we titled, is really to go beyond only discussing policies, or what is the right or the wrong policy, what is the impact of a policy, but also looking at how policies are being implemented, and what is the impact, because very often, of course, it's relatively easy for an innovation agency or a ministry to come up with new policy, but implementation of that is a very different story. And hence we are really focusing on these bureaucratic processes, bureaucratic in a good way, or in a positive way. And so all of the discussions that we have in the book and what follows today as well is very much how do you actually implement, what are the skills and capabilities and resources you need to have a innovative bureaucracy or an innovative impact of bureaucracy on society and economy, because both are, of course, important. So what we really start from our discussions in many ways is this realization that innovation is not only about growth in terms of having more exports or having more GDP or having more patents or publications in the science system, but it's actually about what kind of publication, what kind of patents are they actually helping us in terms of the climate emergency? Are they helping us in decreasing inequality in society? But it's very much about this question of directionality as well. And obviously, if you talk about the direction of innovation, in which direction should we go, what kind of technologies, what kind of solutions, and not only technology, but also social technical solutions as well, regulations, all of those things. Of course, the role of those people who are designing and funding and financing, those projects, regulations, portfolios, programs, becomes even more important because, as I said, you can think about, we want to have more more FDI, but how do you actually make it happen is very much about the question of implementation as well. So of course, then I think many of you have heard this kind of a phrase like you have it here, that civil servants are very often not really interested in finding innovative solutions to complex challenges because they need to follow the procedure and correct rules. And this particular quote comes from Kate Pingham. She was the head of UK's vaccine task force during the COVID pandemic. And as you might remember, UK was the first country to come up with a vaccine, which was a record-breaking time. And she came from industry. She's from a venture capital company, and she was the head of that task force for a year or so. And of course, I think there are very good reasons why bureaucracies tend to be not really focused on innovation and creativity, but actually much more focused on procedure and predictability, because of course many governments here in UK or in Brazil or in Africa or other places in Eastern Europe, wherever in continental Europe, have the challenge of corruption. So you don't want to be corrupt, but you also don't want to seem corrupt. So you have to follow the procurement rules, all of those things. And that's for a very good reasons, of course, right? Because we want the government to be a predictable, transparent as well. So focusing on those rules is not a bad thing, but we also need to be focusing on innovation and finding interesting and new solutions to our very pressing challenges. So hence, actually, trying to do these two things together is actually really the big challenge for bureaucracies. How do you actually provide your basic services if you are an innovation agency or supporting some businesses or universities? How do you provide those services, but also how are you thinking about finding new and better ways of doing those services? So how do you combine these things is really the big challenge. And in some ways, of course, we have to ask, if you look today around innovation agencies or science and technology policy agencies or public development banks, all of those agencies that they are engaging in supporting innovation, whether they are actually themselves innovating, and many of them are actually not. They are just sort of trying to be in a very kind of in a backseat position, supporting businesses or universities or startups and ecosystems, but not really engaging with designing, let's say, new solutions for mobility, or thinking about how do we actually transform food systems, which are one of the major sources of carbon footprints in many countries, for instance, and of course are also sources of inequality and whatnot. So I think innovation agencies are too much of a non-engaging in those issues. And again, we can understand why, but I think that what we really want to see is how do we get them in more engaged positions. And there is this a famous a fable from antiquity, actually, from one of the comedians. I think he wrote about Fox and the Hedgehog, how Fox knows many things and many small things, and the hedgehog knows one thing, and really we'll only do this one thing. And I think many public organizations are like hedgehogs. They just do one thing, or one sort of a portfolio of things they're really focused on, and they are unable really to look around and do other things. And I think in many ways what the book is trying to show is you need both. You need foxes and hedgehogs in public bureaucracies, and this is something that is quite difficult to build. And so we coined this term or concept of agile stability, that of course providing stable routine functions, and particularly if you look at the public sector in a broader perspective outside of SDI and industrial policy, if you look at health services, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at all those other areas, of course the stability of service provision is very important. Because it's about predictability and transparency and non-corruption and all these things. But agility is as important, because you need to react to both the crisis, but you need to also think about the future challenges. So you need to be able to learn quickly. So doing those things at the same time, hedgehog and fox, is something that is quite challenging for public sector organizations to bring together. And this is what we're trying to do. And there is an interesting quote from Brian Eno, who's a famous music producer, and he was really interested in management issues as well, interestingly enough. And so he has been talking about bureaucracy as well, and I think it's very useful the way he's talking about it in terms of like bureaucracy or bureaucrats, civil servants are many ways that the sources of knowledge in society, because they know about bridges and infrastructure and health and environment, all of those things that we need this knowledge in our society, and also keep things running. Maybe not very innovative and maybe not very sexy and cool, but they keep things running, and that's very important for many societies to have this basic level of things going on. And sometimes they are innovating quite radically. And I think what our book is trying to do is sort of finding how do these organizations that can do both these things come about, and whether we can design these organizations on purpose these days. And I think one of the key lessons particularly from history is that a organizational structure or types of organizations in government is not a random thing. So we are used to sort of thinking about that governments are only like the hedgehogs. They're one type of organization. Everybody is part of civil service, and in many countries that seems to be the case as well. But historically, there's always sort of a organizational variety or diversity that is really important, because of course we have new challenges emerging, and we need to find new ways of dealing with those challenges. So we need new capabilities. It's very difficult to build those new capabilities in existing organizations. Very often you need some sort of innovation around organizations. So but actually designing this kind of organizational diversity is something that governments are not really used to focus on. So it's more of an historical accident that we have different types of organizations. And I'll show you some examples as well. So in brief, I think that the book is, and we don't use this analogy in the book, but this is sort of the later thinking, and the way we talk about the book is that you can really think of like three types of organizations, or three types of innovations in government. And I use here an analogy from Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, who talks in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, about 3 stages of transformation of human soul. And how we are, in the beginning we are camels, and then we are lions, and then we are children. And in many ways, if you look for ideal, typical, or archetypical public organizations and the way they innovate, I would argue that these are the 3 archetypes as well. And we talked about these in the book, but I'll get to that as well. And of course, there are, many public organizations need to deliver routine tasks like garbage collection and things like that. There's lots of volume there. You need to do it every day, day in and day out. So there's lots of routine there, and this is like Camels, right? But then sometimes we need to tackle really heavy challenges, what we can call also missions, right? Mission-oriented policies, like going to the moon. It's a very different kind of organization, very different kind of bureaucracy. And I'll show you historical examples how they are, super different organizations. And but they can do and they can tackle very different things. And of course, then you need sometimes you need to experiment. You need to learn very quickly. And as children are, they're learning and they're growing and they're also playing. So I think that these are like archetypical organizations, and you can also think about Max Weber in this context, as I will show you very quickly how you can use Max Weber's theories actually in this context as well. So when we go to, and yeah, I use Friedrich Nietzsche's quotes as well in this context. So when we talk about camels, what do we think about? We think about those. It's a carrying spirit that an organization that can carry a big load and can go a long way. It has this staying power. It can do lots of routine things for very long periods of time. And an example of that, and I call this Weber type 1, which are these classical Weberian organizations that are driven by experts. And an example from that is Singapore. As you might know, it has one of the best public housing schemes in the world. Obviously, they have so little land, so they need to have public housing. Otherwise, the real estate market would be crazy. Nobody could afford anything. So they have lots of public housing in Singapore. And of course, if you think about that, building a public housing is not really a rocket science. It's not really innovative. You need to innovate in the beginning and to be very bold in saying we need public housing. But to keep it going, it's a very simple, relatively simple routine guide of tasks. And yes, you need experts in that bureaucracy and in that organization. But it's not that you need to innovate and you need to learn every day, right? So there's you don't have that many crises. You don't need to innovate that much. It's a very incremental process of just providing incrementally better service, making sure that the things are clean, people get access, all those. So it's a very expert-driven, but a very kind of a simple, but at the same time, amazingly important public service. And there are many of these kind of public services when you just need a quite a typical Weberian expertise-driven, merit-based bureaucracy. People are working in those positions because they know what they're doing, they can deliver those things, and so on and so forth. But this is like the very basic Weberian bureaucracy. And then when we move the line, as Nietzsche would say, these are organizations that really are, they're not really following the existing procedures and processes, but they kind of create their own rules. Or as Weber would say, they're charismatic organizations or charismatic networks. They're driven by usually as a number of individuals who are running these organizations. They create their own rules, but they can also try to solve really big and really thorny challenges because they are these very different kind of organizations. And of course, we can call them entrepreneurial organizations. And this is an example I'm sure many of you know, is DARPA, which is the US Defense Agency that's been around for more than 50 years. And of course, they are very much a technology and military agency. And so here is the first sample of the internet that they created in 1969. But of course, they have been very, very important in very cutting-edge technological issues. So they're very mission-driven, they're specific, problem-driven. They're trying to solve very specific problems, technological problems that usually are associated with military threats and so forth, cybersecurity. But the way the structure of DARPA is set up is very different from the Weberian bureaucracy. It's as I said, it's hardly any sort of a long-term contracts. Everybody has very short-term contracts actually on purpose. People cycle in, they have a very specific task, they cycle out, they're entrepreneurs or scientists, and so on and so forth. And DARPA usually, when they figure out things out, they give it to other agencies to actually fund and scale and all those. So they have a very specific mission that they're there for, and they're very flexible, very flat organization, very different to And there's lots of flexibility in that organization. So very different to Weber type 1. And that's what we call Weber type 2. And what is interesting, if you go and read Max Weber, he actually talks about these, how the sort of the classical bureaucracies are often changed are by those charismatic individuals coming in, creating new organizations, new types of organizations. And in our book, we give a number of historical examples how these things happen as well. And in a way, what we argue, there's always this sort of a existing base layer of the Weberian bureaucracy that is then being innovated on by entrepreneurs and other people who are brought into creating sometimes new organizations. And then these new organizations are being socialized into the fabric of Weberian existing bureaucracy. But again, I think what is really important to realize that these are very different organizations, and they do very different things. They deliver very different kinds of innovation, very different kind of public value and public services. And so we cannot think of them as doing something similar. And now we cut to the child, of course, according to Nietzsche, the children are the ones who were very much about the new beginning and came, playing and so finding out something new and learning, of course, as well. And so here I would say that we have this like two types of organizations that we can call Weber type 3, because they are in a way trying to sort of merge or synthesize different types of Weberian organizations in one. So there's lions that also have elements of children. And here is an example I want to use from Sweden as an innovation agency, Vinnova. So they are very much a mission-driven organization. They are building missions. And here's an example of mission. And they want to make sure that every street in Sweden is healthy, sustainable, and vibrant. So if you think about that, besides highways, Sweden has about 40,000 streets. So obviously Vinnova cannot make every street healthy, sustainable, and vibrant, because that would be impossible for themselves to do it. But they can galvanize and try to get other organizations to support that, local governments, cities, to be part of that. And of course, every city and every street, even in every local area, would approach this very differently, because cities are different, their situations are different. So while you have this overarching mission, you have lots of experimentation, lots of almost street by street. How do we change them? How do we get streets back from cars, have less cars, have more commerce, culture, more interactions? How do we do that? It might be very different. So you have this lion-like mission and focus on that, but you also have this focus on playfulness and experimentation, because you realize that you can't have this one big policy program for all the streets, that you need to have lots of flexibility, lots of differences. And of course, it's a very different kind of a bureaucracy that they are trying to build, which as I was saying here, is much more around activists, so people who are really caring deeply about environment and how do we change our key systems in our society, like mobility or food, because their other mission that they're really focusing on is about food, for instance. So it's really having those big ambitious goals, but actually underneath that, lots of projects, lots of experimentation, and actually lots of learning going on as well. So they have been trying to hire and create new ways of working, which is much more experimental, going really street by street rather than city by city, learning as you go along what really works, what doesn't work, because this is also very contentious, very, very political. How do we, have less cars on the streets, for instance, because that's, people need to get from point A to B to work, to take care of their children and so on and so forth. So you have to have this flexibility in the system. And I think that's why you also need a different kind of bureaucracy, a different kind of bureaucrats. And again, this is what you can do. And there is also what we can see a sort of a second subtype of these Weber type 3 bureaucracies, which are very much we can call hackers. So they're children playful, but they're also really focusing on some of those big public services. And here is an example from government here in the UK, Government Digital Service, that was created more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And what they did was really to try to rethink the entire sort of the way government is interacting with the digital space. So because they thought, in the UK, we don't have digital identity, for instance. So how can you make sure that people find the information that they're needed? How do they find services that they're needed? So they created this idea that actually governments should be in the digital space as a website, because what people need, they are looking for information as they are in Google, right? If I need a new passport or renew my passport, if I need to renew my car license, I look for it. How do I do it? And so hence they created this website, and that led lots of reforms underneath that website. But what they did initially, this website was, they did it in 12 weeks. It costs only about £200,000, which is very cheap for these kind of projects. But it was very much an early version, a prototype of that. So they wanted to get something out there to start learning. How are people actually using? What kind of information they are looking for? So it's, again, rather than thinking about we need to have this enormous digital reform, we need to learn as children. So we need to learn and experiment. But at the same time, we're looking at like major public services. So that they found that the people are actually using it mainly online. They're using about maybe 20 public services. And so you need to make those public services, like passport, for instance, is a major public service, and make that really simple, good, easy to use, because this is what people are looking for online. So I think, again, this is like, Camels, so lots of routine services, but to make those very simple and easy required a different kind of approach to, again, to bureaucracy. Who are the people we are hiring? How do we work as an organization? So combining those elements of Weber 1 and type and 1 and 2 in really interesting ways. And I think this is what we are, our book at the last chapter kind of speculates whether we are then moving into this Weber type 3 or neo-Weberian agency, where we are able to focus on bigger challenges and really big issues, but at the same time to learn quickly as well, to be this quite agile organizations, at the same time really taking on, like, providing or really thinking about major public services like social welfare provision, benefit provision. How do you do them really well? Or when we think about climate change, how do you actually provide major investments and at the same time quickly learn? So how do you take those challenges and also not only quickly learn or are agile as an organization, but really also think about the ecosystem? How do you galvanize other organizations as well? And so this is where we talk in terms of concepts a lot about this idea of dynamic capabilities of public organizations, and we argue that those neo-Weberian agencies are particularly good at having those dynamic capabilities in terms of trying to understand what are the future challenges, and then also shape their portfolios and really network really well in the ecosystem. And again, they might be in science and technology, they might be in social services, and they might be digital agencies, but there are these common elements. And just to the second part of my lecture is really about why do we talk about these issues of state capacity and dynamic capabilities. And we see there's like there's increasing interest in that sector. And I think there's, as you might know, there's also lots of thinking about historically in public sector capacity. Brazil is one of those places where there's historically been lots of focus on state capacity thinking, and particularly around, like Peter Evans has been very influential, I think, in Brazil and other places. But yeah, we can think of this like three different kind of levels, and there are levels of capacity, and there's different kind of schools that are thinking about that and trying to understand how do we build capacity in public organizations. And I think what is really interesting is that there's a variety of ways of trying to analyze, like, for instance, again, looking at those, various indicators like civil service systems, public expenditure management, planning and evaluation, or all those things that are sort of in there. But I think there's always been a kind of difficulty of actually analyzing and addressing public sector capacities. And this is what the book tries to do as well, is sort of tries to understand what are the ways of actually not only thinking about those organizations that we just talked about, but also what goes on in those organizations. What are the key routines, key processes we need to analyze and understand in order to not only just have an understanding whether these organizations are working well, but actually how do we can consciously, purposefully build specific capabilities. And here's another example of those skills, and that's what we can find from literature and lenses. But I think what we find also in our book is that a lot of these capacity conceptualizations are quite abstract, so they're not very useful for actual policymakers, for instance. They're really interesting in academic context, and they are very often not that dynamic, so they sort of explain post factum, and they explain like in a quite a tautological way. If you have positive outcomes, you must have had capabilities. And really, what is really difficult to find in literature is why certain capabilities emerge in certain organizations. What are the mechanisms? And so the book is also trying to figure that. And very often they focus on the state rather than local government. And so we do that a lot. And I think our recent work has been very much trying to synthesize those various strands, also based on some of the work on our book, but also the work of Mariana Mazzucato, and that I have done with Mariana more recently around those capabilities as well. And I think what we try to show is that those more sort of dynamic neo-Weberian organizations are really nested in the long-term capacities, like a civil service systems or public infrastructure, digital infrastructure, for instance. So you just can't. The solution is not just to try to create some of those neo-Weberian agencies. You also have to think about long-term capacities of public sector, and this is how we're sort of thinking about this now. And this is an ongoing work that Mariana and David Dees and I are doing around those. Thinking about this as a pyramid, almost, that you're underlying that you have these long-term capacities like tax collection, civil service systems, all of this, but also consensus building institutions, a political system in many ways, but also whether you actually have this infrastructure investment, whether you have digital infrastructure in terms of digital identity system, payment systems. And on top of that, you build what we then call these lower order capabilities in various organizations. So they're very much about coordination practices, financial management practices, and then so on and so forth. And of course, on top of that, you have really the dynamic capabilities of those neo-Weberian agencies that we just talked about. There's lots about this learning and sense making in terms of, are we able to quickly learn? Are we able to orchestrate various ecosystem players to act together? So we don't need to do everything, but we need to be able to orchestrate them, and also like seizing and shaping. So are we able to muster resources, change procurement rules, or what have you, and actually change those impactfully those ways? So below this sort of the neo-Weberian agency, there's lots of theorizing going on, and then, as I said, this is an ongoing work, and so I'm really keen to understand your feedback for this as well. But this is where I think I am. So I've been talking about more than 30 minutes. So I think that should be is enough. And hopefully, really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rainer. Very interesting and insightful presentation. I will invite now my colleague, Professor Antônio Diegues, to make some comments. And I want to invite all the public here in the Google Meet and the YouTube to put questions in the chat. We can ask for Rainer later. Diegues, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Rainer. I appreciate. I would like to make a few comments, about your proposed background of Agile, stability, and mission-oriented policies, and to hear you some interpretations or comments when applying it to emerging countries' perspective. I have three questions, short questions. In a webinar at UCL 8 months ago, you and Professor Wolfgang Dreschler emphasized that there is a strong support in society for building the agile dimension of bureaucracies. In historical chapters of the book, it is possible to identify that great transformations in the models or paradigms of bureaucracy also took place in parallel with the great transformations in techno-productive paradigms. So currently, in high-income countries, the transformations related to emerging industry 4.0 paradigm and the need to deal with major challenges as sustainability, decarbonization, population aging, are creating, I suppose, bottom-up support for reorganization and the dominant model of bureaucracy, as Swedish Vinnova innovation agents presented by you. So the question is, in this context, I would like to take the opportunity to hear you, some of your comments on how to foster these transitions of the bureaucratic apparatus in emerging countries that, while facing the same global challenges, are still struggling to complete their catching up process. Or in other words, how can we overcome, we have a great concern about that, our institutional lock-in of a bureaucracy that was historically successful in formulating industrial policy, in Brazilian case, during the period of import substitution, but a bureaucracy which is still struggling to transit to a new paradigm where these traditional industrial policies that aim to foster internalization of production is still relevant in our perspective, very relevant, but not sufficient or not enough. And the second question is the idea of a bureaucracy based on agile stability seems to be, in my perspective, the missing point for making mission-oriented development paths more institutionalized. So it's a very strong idea. In a paper in 2020, published in Journal of Industrial Competition and Trade, you suggested a new toolkit to innovation policies in order to face the challenges posed by this perspective. One of the orientations was to establish a clear, measurable, and ambitious mission. So, and in many successful cases presented, the idea of missions seems to be, in an emerging country perspective, seems to be related to some extent to supporting general purpose technologies and related to long-term aims that historically, most of the time, required, if I'm correct, pushing technological frontier. So in this context, what suggestion do you have for thinking about how the bureaucracy should act in emerging countries where there is a dynamic capability gap on the part of local private firms, and these capabilities are mainly concentrated in multinational companies that are the main actors in these most technological markets? So this brief questions just to hear. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Diego. It's very interesting questions. Rainer, do you want to make some comments on Diego's comments? Diego's question?
Yeah, I can, definitely. Thank you so much, Antonio. Very, very interesting, very good comment. And I think that is really interesting, is to discuss the application of some of those things in the emerging market context. And I think my first when we think about like Weber type 1, Weber type 2, and type 3, I would think that particularly in the emerging market context, probably the type 1 plays a very important role, providing sort of basic services in a good way and making sure that these are non-corrupt. For instance, I think that's particularly if you have, in some of the countries you have around natural resources, for instance. I think this is where there's lots of problems around who owns those resources, how they're being used. So I mean, building like a quite classic Weberian bureaucracy around that is probably like a good idea, because you get quite a basic stability. But I think, of course, what we see in some of the Latin American countries is that then this bureaucracy is being politicized, so it's being captured by political interest. And I think this becomes a really big challenge. How do you do that? And so I just today talked to, for instance, I have a PhD student who's working on Nigeria. She's from Nigeria, and she's working on in the Nigerian context, and what she's finding out is actually that in Nigeria you have what we can sort of call like these Weber type 2 organizations that are more flexible and that are not really within the public sector civil service systems, because then they can pay a bit higher wages to bureaucrats, so they can be more flexible, but they have very good leadership, and they are actually able to do like good infrastructure investment and things like that. So I think there is a way, everything, I think you need to contextualize that. So it doesn't mean that you know, in Brazil or in Argentina or Chile, you have these civil service systems that are quite Weberian, that they are then functioning. They might not be functioning. So you need to, if they are not functioning, you need to try to build new different types of organizations next to them. You need to make them more flexible and things like that. So that would be my like main like one point. But I very much agree that Brazil is a really interesting an example where you have these waves of capacity building and very strong capacity, then you have losses of capacity, and again capacity building, and then again losses of capacity. And now hopefully you're on the upturn again. So it's one of those. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, what I always enjoy in talking to Brazilian colleagues is you always have very smart people in Brazil. So there is always hope, but there is always also forces that are against you, unfortunately. But I think, so in many ways, of course, like my own country, Estonia, we had also in 1990s and 2000s, there was also quite a lot of loss of capacity because of focusing only on markets and trying to make sure that markets are working rather than thinking about public sector as a partner for the market. So I think this is where we lost out a bit also in Eastern European context in many ways as well. I think there was a lot of the reforms that privatized, for instance, some of the key public services. And I think also in Latin American context, when you had some of the countries have privatized like water systems and things like that, which is probably not a good idea, because you can't really create markets, but you can extract value. So you generate like adverse incentives for companies to extract value from those systems rather than provide good public services. So I think there is probably really a need to think about like public options, and doesn't mean that you have to renationalize, but you have to think about regaining public control in those cases where you have gone privatized too many things. But at the same time, I think there are like particularly new technologies like digital technology offers countries like Brazil also opportunities to leapfrog. And you have what's the public payment system you have in Brazil, which I think is a great innovation and a great example that is not available in Germany or in other places. Also, if you look at countries like India or Bangladesh, there is like their digital transformation. Of course, there are problems everywhere, but they are much more ahead of countries like Germany, for instance, for various reasons. So I think there is also really opportunities, and that's also what our book is sort of telling as a lesson, is that those new areas, emerging areas, it's much easier to create new effective organizations. So you don't have the problem of incumbent companies, you don't have a problem of incumbent bureaucracies. You can move into that. You can be actually really flexible and agile, and you can also really have very good partnerships with private and public sector. And I think that's really the key, that these partnerships are able to build. So if I were in the position of Brazil as well, I would look for those new technologies. And so there's not only that, not only in digital, but also when we think about food systems, for instance, there is also ways, and agri-food systems, there are ways of thinking about using some of those emerging technologies that might really provide you with food security, but also enable to think about communities that are maybe disadvantaged and things like that. So there's, I think, really interesting opportunities along the way, but I realize this might be difficult. But at the same time, you have to, in some of those countries, you have to focus on mining and resources, because this is a really key, like Chile and Lima, Peru, and places like that. You really need, or Africa has lots of resource issues around that. Yeah, and I think the second question about, I think you're really asking about this co-evolutionary pattern between industry and private, which I think is a really very, very excellent point. And a lot of my earlier work, we really looked at with Eric Reinhardt and others, people you might very well know, and of course colleagues in Brazil as well, Ana Celia Castro and Leonardo Burlamacchi and others. We're really sort of focusing on trying to understand if you have, as you say, it's very asymmetrical systems where you have multinational companies and then few small local domestic companies that are much lower level of technological development or capabilities, how you can actually, what is the role of public sector in that context? And I think that is really key to have a really good understanding of supporting, in many cases, SMEs actually. And that's really the lesson also in digital development, is rather than to work with big multinational companies, is to try to foster your own domestic SME market, because they are usually technologically much more advanced rather than the big multinational companies, and they are very agile, and they are also, of course, very interested in having domestic contracts. And it's very much around like market intelligence and understanding where are those really dynamic areas in your own domestic markets that you can really have it's a good partnerships with your own domestic industry, and particularly in nascent. But I agree that there is a really interesting challenge there of this co-evolution of capabilities in public and private sectors. And this is something I think particularly in emerging markets, this is where the focus really needs to be. And I think in many ways, we are moving into space where that we are realizing that a lot of those problems that we're now talking about, like those challenges, are really actually urban challenges. They are in the cities. So they are like, although agri-food systems are not in non-cities, but actually cities are very much defining those systems, the way we eat, the way we sell the food, all those food waste, all of those things, but also transportation systems. So I think this public sector actually in many ways has a lot more levers than we think to shape those domestic and nascent markets around SMEs and smaller companies rather than bigger ones, because big companies in the food systems tend to have this monopolistic power over markets and actually are squeezing the small producers and things like that. So I think there's lots of interesting things that can be done. But yeah, excellent question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rainer. There is a question in the chat that we received in the chat, but I think you have already answered. I will do if you make to add some comments. The question is from José Vitor Diogo, and José Vitor was asking about the opportunity to learn, one country learn to other countries, to improve bureaucracy and how much they must rely on their own capabilities. I completely agree with your point, Rainer. Applying these questions, these issues to Brazil. In Brazil, the rebirth of industrial policy in the early 2000s had a big problem with bureaucracy, because bureaucracy was in that time very weak, very old, and then they are the good guys that were in bureaucracy in that time also had a problem because they are used to old industrial policy, and they have a lot of difficulties to implement new industrial policies that the government was trying to design that time. But in 15 years after, when we arrived at 2014, for example, 2015, we have a change in the understanding of the industrial policy in Brazil, and the government tried the new government after 2014, after 2016, in fact, tried to end all initiatives on industrial policy and try to include some, let me say, some problems with the institutions and bureaucracy in this time was very important, because Brazilian bureaucracy on the state, on the development bank, on the Ministry of Development, Ministry of Science and Technology, they prevent a higher destruction of the institutions and the bureaucracy. So I completely agree with your point. And I want to invite Marcos, my colleague Marcos Barbieri, he has a point also. Marcos, please.
Professor Kattel, thank you for presentation, for answer. And I will talk about a specific point, but the point in the beginning of chapter 7. There are paragraphs that are very interesting, and I ask about this. You wrote, still, East Asian political leader seem to be creating high visibility changes agents with politically charged dynamic capability. This point, I ask you about how can we contextualize the new Weberian agents in the economic dispute between the Western, especially US and Europe, and the Asian economic, in special China. How could see the new Weberian agents a reaction to face the Asian advance in this contest? In special, in the end of the same paragraph, you wrote hardly even found in the Western Hemisphere outside of wartime or few exceptions. It's a kind of wartime, not a war with weapons, but with an economy. This kind of agents is a kind of possibility to recover the Western economy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Marcus, and great to see that you have reached chapter 7. So you have read the book. So awesome. Yeah, so I'll take one by one. So yeah, the question from the chat about learning from other countries. I think there is I think like, yeah, maybe 10 years ago or so, I wrote a paper with Annalisa Primi from CEPAL at the time, where we talked about like a sort of copying paradox that a lot of countries in the Eastern Europe or in Latin America are very good at copying policies, but don't copy the capabilities, or don't build the same capabilities. So, you know, on paper, if you take like an Estonian or a Brazilian innovation policy and compare it to Korean or Swedish, they're kind of similar, right? But actually, implementation and capabilities and organizational landscape is very different. So it's not about money, but it's actually very often about building consciously those organizations and linkages and understanding what you need to do rather than just. And I think that's at the same time, of course, international learning is very important to learn from experiences. So we also in the Institute, we run something which is called Mission Oriented Innovation Network, where we have 120 organizations globally. And so it's very much like peer learning network, so that innovation agencies are talking to each other. This is what we did. You know, you can learn from us if you want to. You can use our tools, and so it's very much having this community of practice. And I think it's very important because it's all about sort of capacities and capabilities. And of course, they need to be practiced, but they can also be, you know, there's things you can learn, and then you know, other experiences can serve as inspiration. And in terms of Renato, but in terms of like Brazil, I agree that Brazil, like many other countries in that sort of emerging market situation, there is very often the case is actually for public sector is the ability to create markets actually to have, because in many ways you have very often oligopolistic markets. You know, you have in like, for instance, in Brazil, if you look at like financial sector, for instance, you would probably have a very oligopolistic markets, and they're actually not functioning markets. So they're not efficient markets. And they are very good at extracting value from the system, but actually not providing value to the system. So I think that's what, you know, and now you see with inflation, if you look at you know, Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have one of the highest inflation since 2 years. and it's the same food products or same chemical products that are sold in Germany or in Sweden, but we have much higher inflation, and that has to do with the concentration of course, retail industry, transportation industry. So it's the ability to extract because of the lack of competition, actually. And I think that's why I think the actors or bureaucrats in emerging markets have, in a way, a more difficult task, because they need to create markets, make sure there's competition, but also make sure that there's local domestic capabilities to actually compete on those markets. Because if you don't have local, production capabilities or financial capabilities, you're just handing over your sectors to foreign companies to dominate, and then you don't develop the dynamics that you need. So I think that's a really, really key challenge. And in terms of Asia, I think I think it's interesting that, as you said, the Asian countries, we have all read Robert Wade and others in terms of thinking about this is again, like quite a monolithic bureaucracy. But if you look closely, there's lots of changes in Korea, Taiwan. They were very, very innovative in always creating new board or new commission, because they realized that they need to keep this agility in the system of learning, particularly because they back then didn't have democratic systems, but they needed to have contestation in the system, and they continue to do that now as well. So they're trying to build a legitimacy for more innovation, investment in R&D and industrial policy. And I think this is what the Asian countries have been very good at, realizing that they need to provide political cover to some of those investments that might not play out. And this is where I think that particularly European countries have had very big difficulties in actually providing proper industrial policy, proper support. And only now, after COVID, we are realizing that we don't have the production systems in Europe for some of the medications, let alone chips. So we are really at the mercy of Chinese, and particularly if you look at the electric vehicles market, German companies are really struggling because there hasn't been a proper industrial policy to think again about actually market cohesion in terms of how do you have different manufacturers using the same charging points or whatnot. So where Chinese companies and others are much more advanced because of much better industrial policy. And I think, as you say, now that in some ways we can see how the war in Ukraine has played a role in massively increasing investment in green technology and sustainability. So that's where you see lots of investment, but that we're still waiting to see how that plays out. There is also new investment in chip manufacturing, as you see in US, but also in Germany. And I think what the danger of that is that, again, you have a very vertical industrial policy rather than policy that tries to tackle societal challenges as well. I think that's really the danger of new wave of industrial policies, that you focus on chips and green energy, but not really looking at food systems or transportation systems or cities. And because that's where a lot of the inequality is being produced. It's not in energy production, it's actually in those other production systems where inequality is being produced, and where you have lower wages because of technology and whatnot. So you have to have a much more holistic view. But yeah, great questions. Thank you so much.
May I have another? Sorry, I would like to have the opportunity, Professor Rainer. If possible, I would like to hear a couple of words of yours about the Chinese bureaucracy, because it seems to be a very, very, very interesting point that they combine at the same time the idea of the mandate of heaven, which roots are exactly the opposite of the birth of the modern bureaucracy. Yeah, since they are not there, but they seem to be not rational, and they combine at the same time long-term legitimacy with fragmentation and experimentation, and are able to co-evolve with other step by step with other major development challenges. So I would like to hear about how they combine this agile stability in a non-Western type of bureaucracy, but with roots that are based on the heaven and are at the same time rational.
Yeah, no, I think a great question. And I think at one point we had one more China chapter, but then it sort of became a bit unbalanced. And my colleagues, of course, the co-authors have been writing on that topic more. But yeah, I think it is really interesting. And if you read like Isabella Weber's book about Chinese transition, I think what's really important is that they focused on this gradual transition, because that's the way they really learned about the economy, learned about the technology, much more than in the Eastern Europe or also in Latin American countries, where we had much more of a rapid transition from a more planned economy, more industrial policy of the traditional type, into a free market. And in that transition, I think in Eastern Europe, in Russia particularly, of course, but in other places, and I think that might be the same in many Latin American countries as well, we lost the ability to learn as we went along, because we thought all the learning happens on the market, because this is the discovery process on the market, right? So they figure it out. But because Chinese and the party, they focused on, and they had this, they had to fight, right? Who is actually in charge? Are the people who want to have shock therapy or a gradualist approach? And I think this gradualist approach enabled them to learn, and they realized that because it's such a big country, they need to have a lot of autonomy for the regions. And that, of course, you can argue can be the strength of Brazil as well. You are very big. You can think about experimenting in different regions in different ways, and I think they were exceptionally good at doing that and realizing that this regional experimentation, because I think we think of that as like experimenting in policy, but I think that it's from a Chinese perspective, it's very much an experimentation in accountability as well, because they don't have a democratic systems. So there is no like direct feedback, but there is a feedback through, accountability within the party. So if you give the local organization autonomy, they have to perform, right? So this is the accountability system. Otherwise, if you say everything is the same, so we have to plan everything from the top, there is no accountability. And I think they learned from the Soviet Union, where that was the major problem, of course, the accountability in local like regions and other places. So that, the experimentation in accountability. So we always think the Chinese system, this is a autocratic system and there is no accountability, but the accountability functions through this experimentalism. And that is really a great innovation of Chinese capitalism, if you will. But yeah, so I think, and so that's what I've been arguing since I was, I think, undergraduate. I think that what Estonia and other post-Soviet countries got wrong is that we had too radical reforms. We didn't learn how to deal with the new technologies, new production systems, all of these things. And so we have a bureaucracy that is not really capable of talking to industry. When your question about co-evolution with industry is something that I think like Latin American or Eastern European or African bureaucracies are really challenged, because we don't know how to work with industry, and so we are really paranoid about corruption and all of those things, rather than actually having gradually learned to work with industry as Chinese have done. And that's their great advantage. But it's a great question. Yeah, it's a lot of really interesting historical lessons there.
Okay, Rainer, thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. I will ask Diego.
Really enjoyed this. This is really excellent discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Diego, do you have something to add? Marcus?
No, just congratulations, Professor Kattel.
Thanks for inviting us. As I say, I always enjoy talking to my Brazilian friends, so I just made a bunch of new friends. It's always great.
Okay, Rainer, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very interesting. And thank you for the audience. The ones that are broadcasting live, this webinar will be available in some days in our channel at the YouTube, the channel of the Instituto de Economia of the University of Campinas. Thank you very much, everybody, for the audience. Thank you, Rainer. It's a pleasure to receive you online. Hope we can receive you personally very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Appreciate it.